opening panel by Ms. Leah Ranalder. And Leah Ranalder is part of the Climate Change and Urban Environments team at UN Habitat, where she works on multi-level climate action, climate diplomacy, renewable energy, and climate change mitigation in cities. She has recently been selected to be an expert for the IPCC Special Report on Climate Change in Cities. Prior, Leah worked at REN21, the Renewable Energy Policy Network for the 21st century, where she led the work stream on renewables in cities and policy. She was the research director and lead author of the Renewables in Cities Global Status Report and led the work on renewable energy policies for the Renewables Global Status Report. She also worked on public support for energy planning, youth engagement in the energy transition, and fossil fuel divestment campaigns. She holds an MSc in environmental science from Lund University. Leah, thank you so much for joining us. And we are very much looking forward to your keynote speech. And after that, we're going to have a panel together with you and Mr. Afan.
Thank you so much for having me here. Just a quick check. You can hear me okay?
Yes.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. And it's always funny having somebody read out your bio. So thanks so much for having me. Just give me 1 second. I apparently have way too many tabs open to find the correct PowerPoint. Let me just see that this works. Okay, and get it into full screen. Can I just get a confirmation that this is all fine?
Yes, looks great.
Great, thank you. Thanks so much again for having me. I'm Leah, working at UN Habitat. So what I'll try to do here a little bit in my presentation is addressing more or less 3 questions. So what's the progress that has been made on climate action in cities? What are the challenges that exist? What's the lessons we've learned? Where do we need to collaborate more? And then diving quite a bit deeper into the COP processes and cities in them. So that's what I'm going to try to do over the next 10 minutes or so. I hope that many of these numbers that you see on the screen are not a surprise for you when we talk about what progress has been made on climate action in cities. It's, of course, always a tale of 2 faces. There's over 13,000 cities that have committed to reducing their greenhouse gas emissions and adapting to climate change. There's been an increasing recognition that we need cities to achieve the Paris Agreement targets, and I'll go into that in a bit later. And it's also clear that we need cities to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. So the Sustainable Development Goals being broken down in 169 targets, and multiple studies have shown that around 65% of these 169 targets cannot be achieved without the engagement of local governments, of cities and regions. So clearly, there has been progress both in seeing what cities have done, but also in seeing what cities, how cities are being recognized. But it's not a perfect world, so I do want to speak about what challenges exist, and there, of course, quite a bit. I like to break it down into these 5 challenges, and then afterwards I'll dig a bit deeper on one of them. So the one thing is the challenge around multi-level climate action and the NDCs, that if you are familiar with the COP process, it's a conference of the parties, and that means national governments are negotiating this. And that's, although around 70% of the emissions come from cities, it's national governments who are negotiating the climate agreements, the international climate agreements. So cities are not often not sufficiently anchored. They're also often not reflected in the outcome documents. They often don't have a seat at the table. That is changing a bit, but this is still the reality. One other big reality is, of course, finance, where only around 10% of climate finance is reaching the local level. There's been some recent studies that of the climate finance that is available, only around 1% is being used for urban climate adaptation. And if you've seen the devastating pictures of heat waves in cities, floods, landslides, and so on, lots of this is, of course, also impacting the livelihoods, and the societies of people living in cities. Another challenge is local capacity, where often cities lack the human and technical resources to accelerate local climate action. The knowledge might not be available, and if it is available, there's competing priorities, often just one person who might be reporting on working on climate action, but then also having different portfolios, which is, of course, especially a problem in smaller cities. On fourth challenge, technology and innovation, we can almost reach net zero in cities, but the technologies and innovation often don't reach the local level. And then the last one is equity, the challenge of equity, where urban vulnerable groups are often disproportionately affected by climate change. So that's people living in former settlements, but of course also the elderly, children, women, people with disabilities that are proportionately affected by climate change, not only in cities, but also in cities. So that's, so to say, the progress, and much more also the challenges. So I do want to dive a bit deeper into this question of NDCs and multi-level climate action, also because that's what I am particularly working on. So briefly, to understand where we are at, you might have heard a lot of this three-letter acronym, NDCs, recently. So that's the nationally determined contributions, which represent every country's commitments to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and adapt to climate impacts as part of the Paris Agreement. Why is this not right now so exciting? Is because right now national parties are developing their next round of NDCs, the NDCs 3.0. And if you look at the timeline at the bottom, these NDCs are becoming due in February. And we all know that this is a timeline that's somewhat flexible. But why do they matter? Is because they provide a framework for global action, accountability. They help to achieve the targets of the Paris Agreement. And if we saw what happened last year at COP28 during the global stocktake, it was just clear and that we're not on track, and that the NDCs 3.0 was seen as a big opportunity to increase to increase the ambition of national governments. So why do we need to talk about cities and the NDCs? I think I already talked about many of these numbers before, but around 70% of the global primary energy consumption is in cities, around 3/4 of the greenhouse gas emissions are in cities. More than 50% of us live in cities, and we also know that this number is going to increase quite significantly in the next 25 years or so, where around 70% of us are expected to live in cities. So cities are, of course, big drivers of climate change. They are where most of us live, but they're also very vulnerable to climate change, where around 70% of cities have reported that they're already feeling the impacts of climate change today. So that's in 2024, and that, of course, is expected to increase with climate impacts increasing as well. So if we now, I hope I convinced you that we need to talk about cities and their importance in these international negotiations. But if we look at the status of NDCs and how cities are being reflected in this, it's a bit of a bleak picture. Only a bit more than a quarter of the current NDCs have a strong focus on urban content, meaning they reflect on the challenges that cities have, the ones that I've lined out before, and they reflect on the opportunities that exist on mitigating climate change and adapting to climate change. And they really see cities as a priority sector in achieving the NDCs. But if we flip that around, that's, of course, a bit of a disappointing picture, but it can also be an opportunity, where we've seen, and this is where I now want to move into moving between the opportunities that exist, but also the COP processes, is we are seeing increasingly at this international level that there is a commitment to think about cities and regions. We've seen at COP27, UN Habitat worked with the COP presidency to organize the first ministerial meeting on urbanization and climate change. And I don't know if any of you were there, but we needed to have security to get people out of the room because the room was overflowing, and that on the last day of COP, which is often considered a rather low day. So really showcasing that this was a topic that was of interest. COP28, convinced to have the biggest room to talk about cities and urbanization in the COP space, 1,300 people, and the room was full. Now 2 weeks ago at COP29, similar thing, one of the biggest rooms dedicated to the topics of cities and urbanization, and the room was full. So there is an increasing, we are seeing an increasing interest in this topic, in this international space. I do want to highlight the initiative, the pledge that was published last year by the COP28 presidency, CHAMP, which is the Coalition for High Ambition, Multi-Level Partnerships, in which now 74 countries have said we want to work with our subnational governments to work on local climate action, to consult them in the NDC process, and think how we can work together more strategically. So I really see, and this is maybe also my own personal reflection of also COP29, the outcomes and the negotiations were, of course, rather disappointing and also controversial, but we've seen the cities and urbanization topic and community show up strongly. We've seen that cities and regions are there to deliver. They have a lot to contribute to this process. Urbanization is a topic that's of high relevance. And we had the mitigation work plan that was dedicated to cities and building this year. So it really feels like this could be a topic that also gives hope to rescuing the Paris agreements and achieving the SDGs. There is a call to have, of course, more urban climate finance, considering that this is a climate finance COP. But I really perceived it almost as two parallel streams happening at COP, the cities topic, and then the rest of the negotiations. And that's also maybe on a last positive note, gives me hope. What can we still do? Of course, right now, cities and urbanization is also a topic that's not mandated by the UNFCCC. So it is voluntary by the COP presidencies to be picked up as a priority topic. Of course, if it became a mandated meeting, it would get more weight and integration in this. And of course, the UNFCCC is already doing quite a bit to broker the participation of local and regional governments. But I always say, I mean, right now it's a conference of the parties, that means national governments, but a table can be made bigger, and we can make sure that we bring in different actors that that we need to tackle this climate crisis. And then, of course, means cities and regions, but not only them. There's a whole wide of other groups that could benefit from being part of these COP processes in a more inclusive way. I'll stop here. I just want to say, closing window of opportunity, and leave you with a couple of resources on this topic in case that's useful. With that, back to you, Catherine, and any questions, I'm all yours.
Thank you so much, Leah, for this wonderful presentation and for giving us so many insights, and especially this link between the COP process and what is happening on the local level, and how important cities are for actually achieving the NDCs and climate targets.